Prepare yourself for an extraordinary journey through the deepest mysteries of the Bible. Today we're going to explore a passage that has left scientists, theologians, and even NASA engineers completely baffled. A vision so detailed, so precise, and so technologically advanced that it seems impossible to have been written more than 2,500 years ago. We're talking about the first chapter of the book of Ezekiel, where the prophet describes an encounter that defies all logic and human understanding. The prophet in exile. To fully understand this extraordinary story, we first need to know who Ezekiel was. He wasn't just any prophet. Ezekiel was a priest, son of Buzi, who lived among the Jewish exiles in Babylon, on the banks of the Kibar River, around the year 593 BC. Imagine the scene. The people of Israel had been torn from their promised land, deported to a foreign nation, living as captives in a land that worshipped pagan gods. Jerusalem was under siege, the temple would soon be destroyed, and despair hung over the exiles like a dark cloud. It was in this context of absolute despair that Ezekiel had the most extraordinary vision ever recorded in the sacred scriptures. He was exactly 30 years old when the heavens opened before him. The day the heavens opened. It was the 5th day of the 4th month of the 30th year. Ezekiel was among the exiles, near the Kibar River, when something completely unexpected happened. He himself describes, "The heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God." Think about that for a moment. The heavens opened. This wasn't a poetic metaphor, it wasn't a dream during sleep. Ezekiel was fully conscious, in broad daylight, when reality as he knew it was literally torn open before his eyes. What he saw next would be so detailed, so specific, and so technologically advanced that millennia later, NASA engineers would attempt to reconstruct what Ezekiel described using his own words. The storm that wasn't a storm. Ezekiel looked to the north and saw something approaching. He describes it as a stormy wind coming from that direction. But it wasn't an ordinary storm. There was an immense cloud, with fire flashing continually, surrounded by intense brightness. Here begins the first mystery that intrigues scientists. Ezekiel uses the language available in his time to describe something for which he clearly had no adequate words to express. He was seeing something that defied his understanding, something that didn't exist in his time. The cloud glowed. The fire didn't just burn, but flashed continually. And from the center of this luminous mass emanated something that Ezekiel described as gleaming metal, or polished incandescent bronze. Modern meteorologists have analyzed this description and reached a disturbing conclusion. What Ezekiel described doesn't correspond to any known atmospheric phenomenon. It wasn't a desert sandstorm. It wasn't a tornado. It wasn't conventional lightning. It was something more. The 4 living creatures. Then, from the center of this bright and flashing mass, Ezekiel saw 4 living creatures. But they weren't ordinary creatures. The description he gives is so precise, so detailed, and so strange that it has generated endless debates through the centuries. Each creature had a human appearance, but with characteristics that defied any biological logic. Each one had 4 faces and 4 wings. The legs were straight, and the feet were like calves' hooves, gleaming like polished bronze. Here's where things get truly fascinating. Under the wings, in all 4 directions, there was what Ezekiel described as human hands. The 4 creatures had faces and wings, and their wings touched one another. Ezekiel emphasizes a crucial detail. When the creatures moved, they didn't need to turn. Each one had a face pointing in each direction. A face of a man, one of a lion, one of an ox, and one of an eagle. They could move in any direction without rotating their bodies. Stop and think about that. A modern engineer would immediately recognize the value of such a design. The ability to move in any direction without needing to turn is exactly the kind of mobility that designers of spacecraft and advanced drones try to achieve today. The wings that made noise. Ezekiel continues his description with a detail that makes the hair stand on end. He says that when the creatures moved, their wings produced a sound. But it wasn't just any sound. He described it as the sound of many waters, like the voice of the Almighty, a tumult like the sound of an army. Aerospace engineers who read this passage were left speechless. Ezekiel was describing, with perfect precision, the sound that propulsion engines make. The deafening roar, comparable to the sound of a massive waterfall or the movement of an entire army. How could a man from the 6th century BC know that flying machines would make this specific type of sound? He had never seen an airplane, a rocket, or any kind of engine. But his description is frighteningly accurate. When the creatures stopped, they lowered their wings. And Ezekiel mentions that above the expanse over their heads there was something like a throne, and above the throne, a figure with human appearance. The wheels within wheels. But if you think the description was already strange enough, prepare yourself. What comes next is what really made NASA engineers sit up and pay attention. Ezekiel looked at the living creatures and saw something beside each of them, on the earth. They were wheels, but they weren't ordinary wheels. He describes with meticulous details that left modern engineers absolutely perplexed. First, he says that the appearance of the wheels was like beryl, a precious stone of blue-green color that shines intensely. The four wheels had the same appearance, and their construction was as if one wheel were inside another wheel. Think about that. Wheels within wheels. A gyroscopic engineering system that allows movement in any direction without the need for steering. This is exactly the principle behind modern navigation systems, gyroscopes, and even the stabilization mechanisms used in spacecraft. Ezekiel had never seen such technology, but he described it with impressive precision. The detail that left scientists speechless. Here's the detail that really made the difference. Ezekiel says that when he looked more closely at the wheels, he noticed something extraordinary. The rims of the wheels were high and awesome, and they were full of eyes all around the four wheels. Eyes, all around the circumference of the wheels. For centuries, theologians interpreted this symbolically. Perhaps it represented God's omniscience or watching angels. But then modern engineers looked at this description with different eyes. What are eyes on a circular wheel that allow vision in all directions? Sensors, cameras, detection devices. Think of any advanced modern vehicle, an autonomous car, a military drone, a spacecraft. All of them have multiple sensors strategically positioned around their structure to allow complete situational awareness. They need to see in all directions simultaneously. Ezekiel was describing exactly that, using the only word that made sense in his limited vocabulary: eyes. The perfect synchronization. But the description gets even more precise. Ezekiel observes that the wheels moved in perfect synchronization with the living creatures. When the creatures moved, the wheels moved. When the creatures stopped, the wheels stopped. When the creatures rose from the earth, the wheels rose with them. And then Ezekiel makes a statement that is absolutely crucial. For the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. In other words, there was an intelligent connection between the creatures and the wheels. They weren't controlled mechanically, but by some kind of integrated system, a consciousness or intelligence that directed both simultaneously. Doesn't that sound like a computerized control system? A system where multiple components are controlled by a single artificial intelligence or central command system. Josef Blumrich's NASA project. Here's where the story becomes truly extraordinary. In 1974, a NASA chief engineer named Josef F. Blumrich was working on spacecraft design. Someone mentioned to him Ezekiel's vision, suggesting it seemed like a description of a spacecraft. Blumrich, being a skeptic and rigorous scientist, decided to debunk this idea once and for all. He took the biblical text and began analyzing it from an engineering standpoint, expecting to prove it was impossible. What happened next shocked even Blumrich. The more he analyzed Ezekiel's description, the more he realized that not only was it possible, but it was a brilliant design. Blumrich ended up writing an entire book called The Spaceships of Ezekiel, where he presents detailed technical drawings of what the craft Ezekiel described would look like. He discovered that the living creatures could be propulsion units, each with independent movement capability, allowing directional control without the need to rotate the main structure. The wings would be rotors or propeller blades. The wheels within wheels would be gyroscopic landing systems. And the eyes on the wheels? Sensors and camera systems for precise navigation and landing. Blumrich even calculated that the design Ezekiel described would be approximately 50 feet tall and would be perfectly functional with the propulsion technology we know today. The crystal expanse. But Ezekiel's description doesn't end with the creatures and wheels. He looks up and sees something above the heads of the living creatures. He describes it as an expanse, shining like crystal, stretched out over their heads. This expanse, or firmament, was transparent, allowing Ezekiel to see through it, but at the same time solid and structural. Under the expanse, the wings of the creatures were stretched out, touching one another. And above the expanse was what looked like a sapphire throne, and on the throne, a figure with human appearance. Modern engineers looked at this description and saw something familiar: a command dome. A transparent structure, possibly made of some crystalline or advanced acrylic material, that protects the command compartment while allowing full visibility. Modern fighter jets have exactly this type of structure, a transparent canopy that protects the pilot while offering 360-degree vision. The supernatural glow. Ezekiel continues describing the figure on the throne. From the waist up, it looked like gleaming metal, like fire, and was surrounded by brightness. From the waist down, it looked like fire, and a radiant glow surrounded it. He compares the glow to the rainbow that appears in the clouds on a rainy day. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. Here we have to pause and consider something important. Ezekiel is clearly struggling with his ability to describe what he's seeing. He repeatedly uses phrases like appearance of, likeness of, as if it were. These are the words of someone who is seeing something completely outside their frame of reference. He's doing the best he can to describe advanced technology using the language of a Bronze Age man. When he sees something bright and metallic, he says, gleaming metal, or polished bronze, because those are the brightest metals he knows. When he sees intense light around the figure, he compares it with the most beautiful and colorful thing he knows, a rainbow. Ezekiel's reaction. When Ezekiel saw all this, his reaction was immediate and visceral. He fell face down. This wasn't a casual gesture of respect. Ezekiel, a trained priest who had been in the presence of the sacred all his life, was completely overwhelmed by what he was seeing. He was prostrate, unable to stand before this manifestation. And then he heard a voice. The voice addressed him as Son of Man, and told him to stand up, as there was a message to deliver. A spirit entered him and set him on his feet, and Ezekiel began to hear the instructions that would change his life and ministry forever. But what's crucial to understand is that this vision wasn't an end in itself. It was the beginning of Ezekiel's prophetic commission. God was establishing his credentials, so to speak, showing Ezekiel his glory and power before sending him on an impossible mission. The subsequent visions. What many people don't realize is that this wasn't the only time Ezekiel saw this same vision. Throughout his prophetic ministry, he had repeated encounters with this same manifestation. In chapter 3, the glory of the Lord appeared again to Ezekiel, and again he fell face down. In chapter 8, he was taken in vision to Jerusalem, where he saw abominations being committed in the temple. In chapter 10, Ezekiel saw the same living creatures and wheels again, but this time he received additional information. It was revealed to him that the living creatures were cherubim, angelic beings of the highest order. And here's another fascinating detail. In chapter 10, Ezekiel describes the wheels again, but adds that each wheel was called a whirling wheel, or whirlwind, in his presence. This suggests continuous rotational movement, exactly as we would expect from gyroscopic systems. The mobility of glory. One of the most disturbing things about Ezekiel's visions is that God's glory, this manifestation with living creatures, wheels, and the throne, was completely mobile. In chapter 10, Ezekiel sees the glory of the Lord rising from above the cherubim and going to the entrance of the temple. Then it moves out of the temple completely. In chapter 11, he sees the glory of the Lord leaving Jerusalem and stopping over the Mount of Olives. God was leaving his temple. Because of Israel's unfaithfulness, the divine presence was withdrawing. But the point here is the mobility. This wasn't a static manifestation. It could move, rise, descend, travel from one place to another. The wheels, the wings, the entire complex system that Ezekiel described, everything served the purpose of allowing movement. This is consistent with Blumrich's hypothesis that Ezekiel was describing some kind of vehicle, not just an abstract symbolic vision. Interpretations through the centuries. Throughout the centuries, scholars, theologians, and mystics have tried to interpret Ezekiel's vision. In Jewish tradition, the study of this chapter was considered so dangerous and profound that young students were forbidden from reading it until they were at least 30 years old. The Merkabah, or divine chariot, became a central theme in Jewish mysticism. Medieval mystics spent years meditating on every detail of the vision, believing it contained deep secrets about the nature of God and the universe. Christians interpreted the four faces of the living creatures as symbols of the four Gospels: Matthew, man; Mark, lion; Luke, ox; and John, eagle. This interpretation was widely adopted and became part of traditional Christian iconography. But none of these symbolic interpretations really explain the technical precision of Ezekiel's description. They don't explain why a NASA engineer, millennia later, could use the text to draw a functional aerospace vehicle. The skeptic's argument. Of course, not everyone is convinced that Ezekiel saw something physical or technological. Skeptics present various arguments. Some suggest that Ezekiel was having hallucinations, possibly induced by dehydration, exposure to the desert sun, or even psychoactive substances. They point out that other ancient cultures also had visions of celestial beings and divine chariots. Others argue that the vision was purely symbolic, a theological representation of God's power and glory, never intended to be interpreted literally. Still others suggest that Ezekiel saw a rare natural phenomenon, perhaps a combination of sandstorm, lightning, and pareidolia, the human tendency to see familiar patterns in random stimuli. But none of these explanations really satisfy when we look at the level of technical detail in Ezekiel's description. Hallucinations don't produce consistent and technically accurate descriptions. Theological symbolism doesn't result in designs that engineers can turn into functional blueprints. What NASA really says. It's important to clarify that NASA as an institution has never made an official statement about Ezekiel's vision. Josef Blumrich's work was his personal research, not an official NASA project. However, Blumrich wasn't alone. Other engineers and scientists have examined the text and reached similar conclusions. The consensus among those who have analyzed it objectively is that Ezekiel was describing something that had functional components consistent with advanced technology. What makes this even more intriguing is that Ezekiel had no motivation to invent technical details. He wasn't trying to impress anyone with engineering knowledge. He was simply reporting what he saw, the best way he could. And that's perhaps the strongest argument that he was describing something real. The description has the character of genuine eyewitness testimony, confused in some points, struggling with language, but consistent and detailed. The theological implications. If we accept that Ezekiel was describing something physical and real, what does that mean theologically? For some, this suggests that God can choose to manifest through physical and technological means, not just in purely spiritual forms. God is not limited to appearing as abstract light or disembodied voice. He can use vehicles, structures, and manifestations that have real physical components. Others see this as evidence that angels or celestial beings may have access to technology far beyond our current understanding. If cherubim can manipulate matter and energy in ways that seem technological to us, this doesn't diminish their spiritual nature, it just expands our understanding of what spiritual can mean. There are also those who believe that Ezekiel may have seen a visitation from advanced extraterrestrial beings, and interpreted it through his own religious and cultural framework. This is the ancient astronauts interpretation, popularized by writers like Erich von Däniken. But perhaps the most balanced interpretation is that Ezekiel saw exactly what he said he saw, the glory of the Lord manifesting in a way that had real physical components, described as best as possible by a man of his time. Parallels in other scriptures. Interestingly, Ezekiel is not alone in describing divine manifestations that have technical or physical characteristics. When Moses encountered God on Mount Sinai, there was thunder, lightning, a thick cloud, and the sound of a very loud trumpet. The mountain shook violently, and there was fire and smoke. God told Moses to set boundaries around the mountain because it was dangerous to approach. This sounds like safety precautions around a physically dangerous event, not just a purely spiritual manifestation. When Elijah was taken to heaven, he went up in a chariot of fire, with horses of fire, in a whirlwind. Again, we have descriptions of vehicles, fire, possibly propulsion, and violent atmospheric movement. In the book of Revelation, John has visions that include equally strange and technological descriptions, creatures with multiple eyes, flying objects, deafening sounds. There seems to be a pattern in Scripture of divine manifestations that have real physical components, even if the authors struggle to describe them adequately. The modern perspective. Today, we live in an age of drones, spacecraft, virtual reality, and artificial intelligence. We have the vocabulary and conceptual framework to describe advanced technology in ways that Ezekiel simply didn't have. If someone from the 21st century were transported back to Ezekiel's time and saw the same vision, they would probably describe it using terms like spacecraft, propulsion engines, gyroscopic systems, optical sensors, command dome. But Ezekiel had to use words like living creatures, wheels, eyes, wings, expanse like crystal, the only words that made sense in his context. This doesn't make his description less valid. In fact, it makes it more impressive. He managed to convey enough technical information that, millennia later, engineers could reconstruct what he saw. The mystery remains. Despite all the analysis, study, and speculation, Ezekiel's verse continues to be a profound mystery. No one can say with absolute certainty what Ezekiel saw. NASA cannot fully explain it because, even though engineers can create designs based on the description, they cannot build something that defies the laws of physics as we know them. Something that can move in any direction without turning, that can rise and descend vertically with perfect control, that combines propulsion, navigation, and command structure in such an elegant design. Theologians cannot fully explain it because it's beyond their traditional categories of theophany, divine manifestation. It's too physical, too technical, too specific to be just symbol, but too extraordinary to be just technology. Scientists cannot fully explain it because the description involves elements that are beyond our current technology, and certainly far beyond anything that should have existed in the 6th century BC. The message behind the vision. But perhaps we're asking the wrong questions. Perhaps the question isn't, how did this work? Or, what exactly did Ezekiel see? But rather, why did God choose to reveal himself this way? The vision wasn't given to Ezekiel to satisfy scientific curiosity. It was given to commission him as a prophet, to equip him for an impossible mission, to speak to the rebellious people of Israel, to call them to repentance, to warn them of coming judgment. The grandeur and complexity of the vision established that Ezekiel's message didn't come from himself, but from someone infinitely greater, more powerful, and wiser than any human. When Ezekiel spoke hard words of judgment, when he prophesied the destruction of Jerusalem, when he promised future restoration, he could do so with authority because he had seen the glory of the Lord. He had been in the presence of the divine in a way that transcended all normal human experience. The invitation for us. Ezekiel's vision remains as an invitation for all of us, an invitation to recognize that there is more in the universe than we can see, measure, or fully understand. It reminds us that God is not limited by our categories, by our theology, by our science. He can manifest in ways that defy our expectations and expand our understanding. It challenges us to maintain a sense of wonder and reverence before mystery. In an age where we think we can explain everything, where science seems to have an answer for every question, Ezekiel's verse remains as a humble reminder that there are still things that leave us baffled. And perhaps that's exactly what we should feel: bewilderment, wonder, reverence. Perhaps NASA's inability to fully explain isn't a bug, but a feature. A reminder that, no matter how advanced we become, there will always be mysteries that transcend us. The hope in the vision. There is also profound hope in Ezekiel's vision. Remember the context. God's people were in exile, defeated, desperate. The temple would be destroyed. Jerusalem would fall. Everything seemed lost. But the vision showed Ezekiel that God was not limited to the temple in Jerusalem. His glory was mobile. He could be with his people wherever they were, even in pagan Babylon. And this mobility of divine glory meant that one day, when the time was right, it could return. And Ezekiel prophesied exactly that: the future restoration, the return of God's glory. For us today, living in our own age of uncertainty and change, there is hope in Ezekiel's vision. God is not stuck in one place, one time, one form of manifestation. He is infinitely creative, infinitely powerful, infinitely present. Conclusion. The mystery that calls us. The Ezekiel verse that NASA still cannot explain today remains one of the great mysteries of the Bible. It's a passage that confounds both scientists and theologians, that challenges our categories and expands our imagination. Perhaps we'll never know, on this side of eternity, exactly what Ezekiel saw that day on the banks of the Kibar River. Perhaps it's appropriate that some mysteries remain mysteries, calling us to a faith that goes beyond complete understanding. What we do know is this: Ezekiel saw something real, something glorious, something that changed his life forever. And he did the best he could to tell us about it, leaving us with a description so detailed and so precise that, 2,500 years later, we're still trying to understand it. And in that there's a profound lesson. Truth doesn't always fit neatly into our categories. The divine doesn't always conform to our expectations. And sometimes, the most honest answer to a great mystery isn't a confident explanation, but reverent wonder. May we have Ezekiel's humility, willing to faithfully report what we see, even when we don't fully understand. And may we have the wisdom to recognize that there are mysteries in the universe that point us to something greater than ourselves. Ezekiel's vision remains, after all these centuries, as a testimony that we live in a universe stranger, more wonderful, and more full of mystery than we could ever imagine. And perhaps, just perhaps, that's exactly how it should be.